Well, my guest today is Bob Carr, the just retired Foreign Minister of Australia, and prior to that, for over 10 years, the Premier of the largest state in Australia, New South Wales, which is a position approximately comparable to being Premier of Ontario. You have a population here of, what, 7 or 8 million?
Yeah, 7 million.
Yeah, it's a splendid state. As I may say, it's lovely to be back in this magnificent city of Sydney.
Yeah, it's terrific to have you back. You've got a lot of friends from the brief period you owned the Premier newspaper in this town.
I have the most pleasant memories. I'm having a very nice return here. Bob, in your time as Foreign Minister, you had a front row seat on a very eventful period. Would you comment on this widespread theory that the United States is in decline?
I've certainly seen a wobbling in the American leadership. I think to have America make a bold declaration about a pivot to Asia, a rebalance to Asia, and to talk that up, and then suddenly, because of domestic pressure, not be able to attend the lead summit for the East Asia region, invites nations to Australia's north to scratch their heads.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there was Syria. I came out very early in the piece with the support of my Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and said we support America taking a strike, a punitive strike at Syria, to reinforce an important global norm against chemical weapons. But when I got off a plane in the Gulf after making that declaration, I'm greeted by an Australian ambassador who says America's changed its mind. Mm-hmm. It's not going to take this action without getting congressional support.
Yeah, well, which is just a morass. You'll never get anything out of them. But the Constitution of the United States doesn't confer the position of Commander-in-Chief on the Congress, after all. But that's a domestic American matter. But
you see my point, though.
Of course I do.
We make
you can't keep shifting policy.
As an ally of America, rather as Canada is, we'd made a declaration we'll support America through this, and then after a few hours in a plane, you get the news that America has changed course. And of course, America took the case to the G20, and one might ask why. Yeah. Why?
It's an economic forum.
Yeah.
It's not for that sort of thing. Well, look, in a larger area, and before you were the foreign minister, we all went with them into Afghanistan, and they rather abruptly decamped effectively to Iraq and left us as an alliance, and there was a very large number of American allies in Afghanistan, and it was a UN and NATO-supported operation.
The biggest coalition in history.
Yes.
The biggest coalition in history. 50 nations.
Well, everybody was horrified at 9/11 and wanted to be supported, and we were sort of left in the lurch with a terribly undersized expeditionary force to deal with a police action of that size. I mean, we had only, I think, 1,000 Canadians in Kandahar, and we were responsible for 1 million people, and we only had about 600 trigger pullers. It was a difficult mission.
Yeah, I think we're all entitled to think about the lesson of Afghanistan and how it might have been handled differently. Mm-hmm. A very senior Australian strategist, I'm choosing a protective noun here, said to me,
we're all strategists.
Yeah, he said if you went back to 2001, he could have achieved every strategic objective we ended up having in Uruzgan province with no soldiers, but just a ton of money through bribery.
Yeah.
He could have got the strategic gain that we ended up paying for with lives and a lot of money.
Yes.
You could have bribed your way through to the regional ethnic balance to underpin a central governing authority in Afghanistan. And again, back, if we had our time again, 2001, take a quick strike with special forces, taking out Al-Qaeda, but don't embark on this huge task of nation building in one of the poorest, historically most challenging countries in the world.
Yeah. Look, to me, not to digress too much into this, but the decision in Iraq to demobilize 400,000 members of the Iraqi army and police forces. So they were disemployed. They had no salary, no means of support, but they could keep their weapons and their munitions. Well, what on earth did they think was going to happen? Of course, they just rented themselves out as faction.
I don't think it'd be easy to find two people with a fonder disposition to the United States than you and me.
Yeah, mine's altered slightly, but in general, you're right. Yes.
Yeah,
we're very pro-American.
Yeah, but looking at what happened since 2001, you've got to doubt the judgment that Washington can show,
Yes.
and the consistency
Yes.
that Washington is capable of, and the idea that large parts of the world, especially the world as challenging as the Middle East, can be rebuilt, reshaped with American genius out of Washington is no longer sustainable.
And there's this misapplication of the lessons of the post-war period. I mean, rebuilding very sophisticated countries like Germany and Japan, which were great powers before the war, but just smashed up during the war, was comparatively simple. What the more challenging part was to help them with democratic institutions, and that was successful. But actually reconstructing the societies and the economies was not difficult in those countries, comparatively speaking.
No, they sprang back into life.
Yeah.
They sprang back into life.
Well, it was the culture of Goethe and Beethoven. You know, they didn't need a great many lessons from us in most aspects of civilization. Politics was something else. Let me ask you this: in the international community, is there not a reservoir of skepticism or concern because of the United States' huge current account deficit and its huge budget deficits and this unorthodox, to put it in its most polite manner, in which they finance the federal government deficit just by issuing notes to themselves through the central bank?
Yeah, well, in Asia, that skepticism is expressed in this form. The Chinese, in talking to nations of Southeast Asia especially, will plant skepticism about whether America is financially capable of maintaining its commitment to the region. The message from the Chinese is something along the lines of, we're always going to be here. Can you really trust the Americans when they say the same?
Sort of a neo-Gaullist message, yes. So, or Gorbachev saying our European home. I mean, they don't really belong here. We're Asians, and they're running out of money.
Yeah, a bit of that.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the northern ASEAN nations, those of Indochina, they look with a bit of wisdom at America declaring it's got a commitment to this region. And as some Thais put it to me, why doesn't America just do it and not talk about it?
Yes.
Or as an Indonesian put it to Henry Kissinger, we want America in the region, but just over the horizon. Yes. We want America in the region, but we don't want to have to choose.
What does that mean? Choose what? Between what?
Well, the Indonesians and the Thais, for example, they're not alone in this respect in the region. They want to have America there, but they don't want to be put in the position of having to say, we're with America, we're against China.
They really want them in case the Chinese become aggressive.
I think that's a fair reading, and that's referred to as hedging.
Yeah.
Hedging in case...
Perfectly reasonable policy.
Yeah, in case China were to turn nationalistic and nasty. And I've got to say that looking at China today, we as Australians see a lot of benefits flowing from the re-emergence of China to the great power status it held before it was torn apart by European and American imperialists in the early 19th century.
Decrepitude. Yes.
Yeah.
And are you an adherent to that view, that there are great advantages flowing out,
yes.
even as far as Australia?
Yeah, we do. We think that. We think the rise of China, and conservatives as well as Labor politicians have said this in Australia, the rise of China is good for China and good for the world.
Yes.
I think even looking at human rights, while one can never say we're no longer going to engage with China about rights, that's always a democracy always engages about rights. We always want a dialogue with China about rights. Yeah. But I think you've got to recognise that there's been a quantum gain for human rights in China given the economic progress. The fact that a married couple have got a room of their own and don't live in a dormitory in a commune.
Or in a grass shed or something.
Yeah, with all their family members crowded in with them. Mm-hmm. The fact that you haven't got shared communal apartments. Can you think of a worse advertisement for socialist experimentation than communal apartments? Who wants communal living? the fact that that's being put behind them has got to be seen as a colossal gain for human rights.
Look, just at a human level, the spectacle of China and India between them pulling tens of millions of people upwards out of poverty every year is a very gratifying and a good thing.
It's heroic, and it's been done in a way that complements the great achievement of Western civilization: competitive economies, market economies, achieving a revolution in the human condition.
And look, I'm not an expert in China, but I think those who are unanimous that it is a much less severe dictatorship than it was 30 years ago.
Yes. And I also believe that the new leadership is determined, without risking the Communist Party monopoly on power, which is the cornerstone of the system. It's a Marxist-Leninist system. By that
pretty
definition.
Strange definition of Marxist-Leninism, but yes, I take your point.
Yeah. Without putting that at risk, they are serious as a result of their own dynamics about a movement on human rights. Now, what form that will take?
That's interesting.
Yeah, whether it takes.
Is this Chinese pride that they object to being condescended to on that grounds, and therefore they're accommodating it, or is it entirely tactical, or is it a grace of conversion of some sort?
They certainly don't want to be lectured publicly about what we take to be failings in their system. I think there's a lot you can get from a dialogue that's not megaphone diplomacy. But there will be something happening. As Henry Kissinger puts it, in 10 years' time, when there's the next leadership transition, it's hard to believe that it's going to be under these rules. So whether you're going to see, one, more internal party democracy, or two, greater deference to process, to the rule of law, which means more independence for the judicial system, I don't know. But this is going to be one of the...
But they're starting from scratch in Western terms, institutional. I mean, they don't have serious political institutions that anyone would repose any faith in.
No, and as I understand it, a China expert might correct me, but as I understand it, there's no possibility of the court system overruling the government or the party,
no, I don't think
which is a crucial test for political pluralism, isn't it?
Even President Andrew Jackson said the Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And he was a Democrat, after all.
Yeah.
But let me ask you, from our perspective, you're a lot closer to China than we are. It seemed, to me at least, but I think this was a general view in the West, that the stand down of the colonels in Myanmar, Burma, and the apparent compromise that the Chinese made with the Vietnamese and the arguments they were having about the China Sea and so forth, looked like China actually retrenching and to some extent being pushed back a bit by the region. Because I think in general the Indonesians, the Japanese and others, Filipinos, agreed with what the Vietnamese were saying. And there is, when China tends to assert itself a little bit opposite its neighbors, the whole ring of its neighbors tend to join in trying to discourage that. Now, am I dreaming, or is this actually happening? Is there a fair degree of cooperation in the area in the event of China becoming over-assertive?
Yeah, I'd put it this way. I think China's always going to have influence. It's always going to have a pulling power in Indochina, the northern ASEAN region. It will always have a pulling power. But I think there'll be a healthy self-correction.
Well, there's thousands of years of precedent for that. You know, the Indo-Chinese are not, they're not China worshippers.
Yeah. And there are a lot of different forces there. There's the ethnic diversity in Myanmar. There's the force of Vietnamese nationalism, as Henry Kissinger said. The French, the Americans, the Chinese, in their war with Vietnam in 1979, have learned how powerful Vietnamese nationalism can be. I think there's going to be a self-correcting process. If China and Cambodia is seen as buying up too much land or getting the best of various deals, the political system, even in Cambodia, will register a protest. And I think the rulers of Myanmar will see the market of China, they'll see the opportunity for beneficial investment out of China, but they'll also see the need and the appeal in balancing that with investment from the West.
And how are the overseas Chinese playing it? Singapore, for example. I mean, they're quite emphatically proud Han Chinese, but they are no pawns of China politically. Is that correct?
No, they're not. I mean, Singapore is akin to Australia.
Mm-hmm.
They do see a great value in a US presence.
Mm-hmm.
They want America to be consistent. They're nervous about that. But
well, Lee Kuan Yew has been raving and fuming about American torpor for decades.
Yes, yeah, and as for public opinion in Singapore, there's a bit of pushback against the arrival of Chinese guest workers.
Oh.
Singapore is a very interesting society, but it's a terrific story. Corruption resistant, the growth of freedoms, cultivation of freedoms as a government policy.
Pretty authoritarian government.
Yeah, but they've softened the edges of that authoritarianism in a way that makes it a very interesting model, and one that the Chinese must take account of, I think, as an option for China.
It's a terrific success story.
Oh, an astonishing success story. They've completed that arc, and they've done it by remaining corruption resistant. And corruption, governance, as we politely call it, is a challenge in the other countries of Southeast Asia. But they've completed the arc of progress towards developed world status without being tainted by corruption.
And if I'm not mistaken, Singapore was effectively expelled from Malaysia.
Yes.
Because the Tunku was concerned about Chinese influence, but didn't want civil strife. So he just sort of severed the country and said, you know, God bless you, but you're on your own.
And,
which, in a way, was a rather enlightened thing to do, I suppose.
Yeah, and it was a huge stimulus for Lee Kuan Yew to get cracking. I heard Lee Kuan Yew say once, he said, well, look, I come down to Australia from time to time, and you've got the sense there'll always be in Australia, this huge continent, people, sheep. And he said, I can't have that confidence that Singapore's security is taken care of forever.
Yeah.
It's a nation state, and not for nothing have they got the feistiest defence force in the region, which trains in Australia.
You're a very peppy foreign minister. Did you have, in your time as foreign minister, many dealings with the Russians?
No, but they were memorable. And my last meeting with Sergei Lavrov was in that wedding cake Gothic Stalinist skyscraper, one of the seven...
Socialist realism.
Yeah, one of those seven ugly sisters that form a ring around Moscow, skyscrapers of the early 50s. And he argued a case on Syria, because I raised the humanitarian implications of the Syrian tragedy, but he put a case that was internally robust and consistent. And it had half a dozen layers, and they were quite powerful. Russia, with its big Islamic population, I think about 10%, its borders with Islamic countries, has got a strong view about the presence of al-Nusra and al-Qaeda in the Syrian opposition.
There have been terrorist atrocities in Russia.
And other perspectives as well. And again, let me quote our mutual friend Henry Kissinger, who said, there's no value, as we talk about Syria, in demonising Russia. And I think he implied in that you'll only get a political solution there, instead of this ruinous civil war, by engaging Russia.
And do you, I don't want to oversimplify, I mean, Russia's, of course, a very complicated country, but it's not as complicated as it was when it had twice as many people and was the Soviet Union. And there is this contest historically in Russia between the Western emulators led by Peter the Great and the nativists of the Tolstoy tradition. It seems to me that the present government, Putin's government, is pitching it to old Russian nationalism, and is dedicated altogether to getting greater recognition for Russia in the world after the terrible debacle of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do they have any policy that you can detect other than agitating in a way to impress the world with the fact that Russia's still here and is still important? Is there anything more to it than that?
I think we've got to dwell on the trauma that Russia has suffered here. spoken of as an empire since the time of Peter the Great.
Yes.
Spoken of as an empire. And then forced to think of itself as having lost Ukraine and all those other republics.
And a more traumatizing thing than the loss of the British Empire. I mean, India was never part of the United Kingdom.
Lost and came close to losing Tatarstan.
Yeah.
A special deal to keep Tatarstan in the Russian Federation. So that is, you think of yourself as an empire for 3 centuries, and all of a sudden you've got parts of the empire now independent republics on your border. You're worried about an underpopulated Siberia with China on the other side. And Islamism is very threatening, given the 10% of the population that is Islamic and subject, they fear, to radicalisation. I just think we've got to engage with Russia. I feel a sympathy for a nation and a people that suffered.
Well, it is a very distinguished nationality. It's a great culture and a great civilization.
And
it's the land of
endurance.
Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky and so on. But they are very difficult politically, and by our standards, they've not had one day of good government.
My last day as Foreign Minister of Australia, after the G20, the government I was part of was being voted out of power back in Australia. The only polling day since I was 15, when I hadn't been in the country working on a polling booth.
You were like Churchill at Potsdam.
Yes. Only at St. Petersburg after the G20. And I had the great honour, on a sunshiny September day, of walking out and putting a wreath on the memorial in a cemetery where there were mass graves that held the remains of 500,000 citizens of Leningrad who starved to death or died of famine or were killed in bombing.
Yes.
As this hero city held out against the Nazi barbarians. And I thought the towering achievement of these people is endurance. And who could do other than wish them well and hope that somehow, in the emergence from beyond communism and the chaos that followed its collapse in the 1990s, they get the right balance.
No, look, it is an unconquerable country, and it's a magnificent country in many ways. But they really haven't had any good government. They had a couple of gentle czars who were somewhat reform-minded, and it must be said that some of their autocrats were very capable, and Peter the Great was. To be fair, Stalin was. He was a very clever man, but it wasn't good government by Western standards.
No, and all the missed opportunities. Stolypin,
yes. Yes.
An authoritarian reformist who, if he'd had 10 years, could have created a strong, I guess, constitutional monarchy.
But the Tsar didn't have the staying power.
Well, that Tsar was stupid.
Yes.
And the difficulty about despotic monarchical systems is you might get a good, very good ruler like Alexander II, Alexander III. You can get the idiot's son taking over. Yes.
Now, I feel great kinship. I mean, I think in general Canadians and Australians do have much in common, and I want to get to that in a second. But we were, if I may lead the witness here slightly, basically put over the side by the British when they plunged headlong into Europe under Ted Heath. And I think Britain, it is now clear, made a strategic error, because Australia and Canada and New Zealand have done a lot better actually than Europe has. And we had great loyalty to Britain. Not blind loyalty, but comradeship and solidarity. And there's never, as you know, in the history of the world been anything like the numbers of volunteers produced by Canada and Australia to go overseas and help the British in wars where our countries were not at risk ourselves.
Indeed, yeah.
But how do you see Europe now? I mean, do you think it's regrouping on more realistic lines, or what's happening there?
I think Canada and Australia, let alone the United States, represent terrific flourishings of English-speaking civilization. What great advertisements for that empire with all its shortcomings. The Opium Wars and terrible treatment of native...
And I'm sure they did utterly stupid things here as governors as they did in Canada sometimes. But you're right, it's still a great advertisement.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact that we got self-government in the 1850s, And there was never a military coup, never a revolution, never mob rule. As in Canada, responsible government, prime ministerial government, with the Westminster system, just took root.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Well, we had a
terrific
couple of
achievement.
minor rebellions, but they didn't amount to
Yeah,
much.
yeah, it's just a terrific advertisement. Now, we were never inclined to leave the British Empire. There was no Australian Declaration of Independence. We weren't going to leave this empire. They left us when they pulled out of their military commitment. It was known in the 1960s as East of Suez.
Yes.
Getting out of East of Suez.
Which was a completely disastrous thing to do, but that's another matter.
Yeah, and sought entry to the European market.
Well, they just abdicated to the Americans.
Yeah, yeah.
But looking at Europe now, I mean, obviously there were excessive hopes for it. There were all sorts of fantasies about Europe, the countries all standing on each other's shoulders and becoming again the center of the world as they were 100 years ago and so forth. But on the other hand, it is a magnificent thing that these countries that were at each other's throats for centuries are now cooperating so closely. But looking past the immediate economic problems, what do you think Europe is going to look like in 20 years?
Well, I think the world needs European values to elevate human rights, to talk about environmental protection. What other civilizations, what other cultures concern themselves with universal values? I think that's the...
Well, the rest of us in the West do.
Yeah, but as a
North
result
Americans
of
and
that,
Australians,
but we're offshoots of the European view. I think the Enlightenment and the focus on human rights is very special to the world. But I'm just worried that without slashing economic reforms, these European welfare-based societies are going to become decrepit.
Yeah, well, they've been paying too much Danegeld to the working class and the small farmers for obvious, notoriously well-known historic reasons in Europe, because they get so many revolutions if they don't. But they can't afford it anymore.
Yeah, I think the tradition of Christian democracy, the Christian social vision in Europe, has prevented a reformist Thatcherite vision taking hold.
Yes.
And there haven't been a lot of decisive economic reforms to free up markets.
And yet, in fairness, Schroeder,
Schroeder,
a scoundrel
say
and a social democrat, he got somewhat Thatcherite, and he did roll things back. And Merkel gives him credit for it.
Yes, in retrospect, Schroeder's record stands up very well, and he tackled the hard areas. And there are hard areas for a social democrat or a Labour leader.
Yes.
There are unemployment benefits and pension benefits. They were the big things. And shopping hours, which were notoriously restrictive in Germany, apparently. He freed those up.
Yeah. And the fact is, it is the case that there's a sort of a hard currency core to Europe. The old Gross Deutschland. I mean, the Germany that Bismarck, and with the utmost hesitancy that I refer to him at all, but Hitler aspired to, which is essentially Germany all along the Baltic except Russia, both sides of it, Poland, the Czechs, the Dutch, the Austrians. And they are a sort of economic solid group that's performed quite well. The softer currencies and places where a false prospectus was sold as they entered the euro came along from the Mediterranean countries.
One of the promising concepts of Europe was that it would be a means, European Union would be a means of transferring the North European work ethic
Yes.
to the Mediterranean.
Yes, yes, but there's, in all of their glorious history, Italy and Greece never had a hard currency.
And the Greeks instead of taking the German work ethic, took its welfare entitlements and adopted that for its workforce.
Yeah, no, they used to have those hilarious jokes about German efficiency and Italian good nature and manners or something, or cheerfulness, and turn it all around, and you get the worst of everything. But the fact is, I mean, do you see Europe actually navigating through these problems and continuing as a somewhat coherent political entity?
Well, let's cut to the chase. 1% growth
Won't fly.
Where does that leave them?
No, they've got to do better.
Yeah. Where does that leave them? And you can only do better than that by freeing up markets, I would think. I mean, this is a very conventional view on my part.
Well, you could end up with a hard currency block around Germany and the rest of it a common market, but not the same currency. Anyway, let me ask you this: we Australians and Canadians, it seems to me, now that I have had the good fortune to have a good deal of experience in Australia, have a lot in common, not just for obvious historic reasons, but there's a large French population in Canada, but we're essentially English-speaking democratic countries, and but two, we are, all things considered, and this is a completely nonpartisan statement for both countries, are among the best governed countries in the world.
Yeah.
And the performance of Canada and Australia has been brilliant.
Yeah.
Comparatively.
Yeah, I agree.
And it is. I always find it such an agreeable experience to come here that I can't believe that we couldn't capitalize on this and make a closer relationship somehow. I mean, the Pacific Ocean is a colossal space to fly across, as I just reminded myself the other day. But the fact is, these spaces aren't what they used to be, given the advance of technology. Now, what can we do constructively to tighten relations between ourselves? Because I see absolutely no disagreement between us, and if we work together, we would have more than double the influence that we have singly.
Yes, I agree. I don't know. I think because we are so similar, it's easy to overlook what one another offers. But it's very easy to work with Canadians, I found. I'm interested in sharing with Canada what we have learnt and are learning through a deeper engagement with Asia, Southeast Asia especially, I think. And I think the Canadian inroads into Latin America,
It's a very interesting development.
Commercial inroads offer value to us. But I think because the relationship is so comfortable, we're just both challenged to think of a way of giving it more traction.
Yeah, it may be that there's no institutional way to capitalize on it, and we just have to be spontaneous in the confident knowledge that we'll be complementary in what we do.
Yeah, and I think the most useful thing would be a deep personal rapport between an Australian Prime Minister and a Canadian Prime Minister. I think a lot would follow.
We had a bit of that, didn't we, between Mr. Menzies and Mr. Saint-Laurent, but I don't know if we've had it since.
No, I don't think we've had it since, unless John Howard and Prime Minister Chrétien.
Well, they were quite friendly, I think.
Yeah, they were quite friendly, and Howard enjoyed working with him very much.
Yeah.
Despite the party political gap.
There would be a gap there, yeah. Can I just ask one final thing? We're all somewhat interested in Britain for a variety of reasons, most of them too obvious to mention. Do you have any prediction about Britain? I mean, it plunged into Europe, then it put all its bets on the special relationship, and now it's somewhat in an ambiguous position. Obviously, it'll always be there, and it's an important country, but do you have any predictions for it?
Yeah, first of all, I like their foreign policy very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to deal with William Hague, who's
very nice man.
Very nice man. He's elevated the relationship with...
He named me to the House of Lords.
Wow. Well, he'd appreciate your writing, among other things.
Yeah, he does. Yeah. And I appreciate his, too.
Yeah. I think he's shown that Britain can have punch above its weight, if I can be so condescending, in foreign policy terms. And I want to, whatever happens with British politics, I want to have Britain continuing to do what it's done under both governments. I thought Blair and Brown were exemplary internationalists.
Yes.
Their commitment
in
to
alliance
Africa,
terms, they were terrific.
Yes, and with America, and their commitment to Africa, their commitment to big aid programs, which has been continued by Cameron. I think a fairly bold activist foreign policy, and I want to see if there's a Labor government there. I'd expect it to be continued.
Well, I admire your optimism. Bob, it is lovely to see you again, and thank you for being so generous with your time.
Conrad, it's my pleasure. Always great to see you. It's like, if we can quote one of our heroes, it's like uncorking a bottle of champagne.
The first bottle of champagne.
The first bottle of
Mr.
champagne.
Churchill said of Mr. Roosevelt. Yeah.